Matthijs van Dijk, composer, arranger, violinist, chart ensemblist, or nightlight collectivist, depending on whose article you read, and apparently now internet radio presenter of the series The South African Composers Archive. I work a lot in the Western classical and symphonic music idiom, having had works performed by artists such as the Carnegie Hall-affiliated Dakota Ensemble, E Musicanti and Peter Donahoe, the LGT Young Soloists, and the Zignum Quartet. My arranging work is regularly featured in symphonic pops concerts such as Starlight Classics and the award-winning collaboration between Karen Zoid and the Cape Philharmonic Orchestra, of which I was the musical director. Besides for my orchestrations and arranging work, some of you might know me from my piece Moments in a Life with Rivonia trialist Dennis Goldberg, who sadly passed away at the beginning of 2020. Should this introduction sound at all familiar, it's because it's almost the exact same one I gave last year, so I've decided should there be any repetition between what I'm saying now and what I said then, I'll spice things up with a couple of embarrassing true stories of my childhood. So, story number 1, when I was in grade 2, I fell into the Little Theatre Orchestra pit. I was dressed as a seahorse at the time. I wanted to give a little bit of backstory on what you're going to hear this evening, which will involve having to look at 3 periods of my life in a little bit more detail. In 2009, I opted to use the Samro Composition Prize I had won to have masterclasses with anyone who would see me. While living in New York, I was very fortunate to have a lesson with Missy Matsoli. Before meeting with her, I sent her a few recordings of my stuff, mentioning that I like to blend rock and metal into my compositions. She pointed out to me that while I said there was rock in it, she couldn't really hear it. What followed was a long conversation with her about why I felt the need to bury these influences. For context, when I was a student in the early 2000s, while there definitely were quite a few people who were very supportive of my compositions, as well as my rock band Dawn Treader and the rock arrangements I did later on for the Sontonga Quartet, the feeling that I got from a certain bodies at the institution, who I, as a young composer, would have been trying to get respect and recognition from, was that classical music was viewed as a far superior art form over, say, heavy metal. And even under the broader banner of classical music, what we were being taught would generally lean towards a more traditional approach, focusing much more on the canon than what was being written at that moment in time outside of the university. As an aside, it's worth mentioning that when I began my studies, there wasn't even a composition stream to speak of, as it had been morphed into a general degree thing a few years earlier. I was very fortunate to have grown up in an environment where my father, composer Peter Louis van Dijk, was also my first composition teacher, exposing me to a lot of new and exciting ideas, from Stravinsky to Adams, all before high school. With this information stored, and obviously realizing that taste is very subjective, as well as it being a very different time then, I have to say I was very perplexed repeatedly being singled out for things like using, quote, ugly chords, or being part of discussions which would mock the more experimental sides of composition in the year 2003. So, as a 20-year-old, in an attempt to try have my music liked by my peers and get performances in venues that we were trained to believe mattered, I leaned towards the classical side, much more than the rock, subtly weaving in rock gestures that would at least give me a warm feeling inside, while hoping the cool kids would notice. Through this conversation with Matsoli, she encouraged me to lean into these roots, basically saying to me, who cares what other people think? Sometimes you need to hear that. I took her advice, writing sketches for an uncompleted chamber work that was designed to be performed in nightclubs in lieu of a DJ. This approach was also very inspired by experiencing the, to the best of my knowledge at the time, relatively new practice of having contemporary classical music being performed in bars, something that I became obsessed with, eventually doing so with my own ensemble when I returned to South Africa. As an aside, these DJ sketches, for want of a better word, is what became the basis for the piece I played at the very beginning. However, still in early 2010, the final push to shed my overtly classical approach came when, a few months later, I was having a masterclass with a composer in Germany who decided to basically kick me around for most of the lesson with what I felt was extremely little constructive criticism. The moment that stayed with me was when, after 2 hours of being repeatedly told how crap my music is from every angle, I asked if there was anything he could suggest to fix what I had written, his response being words to the effect of, there are so many problem areas, there's nothing I can do to help you. While this lesson reminded me why I had opted to begin with to use the Samro bursary to meet as many composers as time and money would allow, instead of the route of being stuck at one institution for several years, potentially with one butthole, I was so disheartened by it, I had basically already decided to quit music by the time I had walked home. Because of the modern music bad experiences I had at varsity, the Stockhausen on steroids approach did absolutely nothing for me. I felt much more comfortable with the new music that I'd been hearing in America, but it felt that the Europe route would be the one I would have to take in order to be taken seriously within the classical industry I was courting. The result was a feeling of displacement. What is the point of creating anything if no one was going to listen to it? After about a week of pondering this poop fistacular of a lesson, accompanied by imported Niederberg Baron that I'd found at my local grocery store, I decided that, seeing as I was going to quit music, I may as well write one last piece exactly how I wanted to write it, with two large middle fingers saluting the classical music world in general. So, as my band no longer existed, and I felt it was a shame that some of the songs I'd written for the group would never be heard again, I reworked a song called Personal Graffiti, which lyrically dealt a lot with finding my own identity as a young 20-something. To bookend it, I wrote shorter movements on either end, taking a lot of inspiration from bands such as Nine Inch Nails, Opeth, Radiohead, and Led Zeppelin, trying to capture the mood those artists created. Throwing this all into a blender, this became my 7th string quartet. Personal Graffiti, I believe, in many ways laid the foundation for whatever form of a career it is that I have. It's the reason the Shot Ensemble or Nightlight Collective exists. It's something that, just by being there, led to many opportunities and concerts that I'd not really had by that point, both with the group and for my own stuff. Something worth mentioning, which I hinted at earlier, is that one of the other life lessons I inadvertently learned while studying was that performing your own music and not having it be performed by other people apparently meant that you had failed somehow. So, outside of my band and yearly macabre ensemble performances, if it was my classical music, I resisted playing it for a very long time. Just to be clear, at no point in this at all will I say that I'm particularly smart, but I am genuinely surprised that more local classical composers haven't attempted this route, having had the just start a band conversation with quite a few frustrated young musicians. I think even with our current situation in the arts, globally and especially locally, it's still very applicable, but for some reason still only seems to apply to jazz and popular music. If there are local groups out there like this, please do let me know. I'm always looking to collaborate. It did, however, take me a while to get to this point. In 2014, after years of struggling to find a quartet that would be interested in performing the work, spurred on from a combination of just having had the just start a band conversation, this time from Robert Fockens, and with the encouragement from my then partner Sarah Evans, gently reminding me that I do actually know people who might be interested in playing together with me, Galina Juritz, Nicola DeToy, and Sarah and myself got together one evening, drank a lot of red wine, played through the quartet, and laughed a lot about a story I told regarding the worst rehearsal that I'd ever had, probably answering the question why exactly we called ourselves what we did. While I can't speak on everyone's behalf, what I think definitely helped the group beyond one concert and done is that the piece captured an ever so slightly subversive shut up grandma, you can't tell me what to do mood, and facilitated a pushback towards the art is only real if I say it is BS that the four of us had all experienced while studying to varying degrees. This began a wonderful and very creatively fulfilling period in my life. So long concert clothes, playing whatever you feel is comfortable. Concert venues are what we make any venues to be. Play in bars, play in vintage car garages, play in someone's lounge, and why yes, the name is a poo joke, even more so when people would spell it incorrectly. The intention of the group was always that it would be flexible in size, and by regularly joining forces with other like-minded composers and performers, such as Lungiswa Plaikis and Cara Stacey, who later became a permanent member, it helped, I think for all of us, to grow whatever kind of audience we have. Also, I don't think it's a coincidence that I was asked to write the piece with Mr. Goldberg around the time I was busiest with the group, in the middle of our year-long residency at the Blah Blah Bar. If one is posting about gigs every couple of days, eventually people start noticing. Embarrassing story number 2. When I was about 5 years old, one afternoon, after watching a movie with my brother that involved a character falling from a massive height and landing safely in a trash can below, the two of us decided to recreate the scene by throwing various soft and hard toys from the second story of our house. My brother, ever the great director, cast me as the trash can below. To go back to 2010 for a moment, I am fortunate that during the last few weeks of my Samro traveling, I met up with the Dutch composer Samuel Friesen, on Matsoli's recommendation. While I was by this point pretty over the whole concept of contemporary classical music, Friesen sat with me for 3 open-ended lessons where we would just talk about music all day and delve deeper into the gaps that were found in my knowledge. As an example, I remember one conversation in particular where he enthusiastically discussed his favorite performance of 433, telling me which ones to avoid, and I remember spending a lot of that conversation thinking, it's just effing silence, how different can it be? His enthusiasm, however, was very infectious, and I think he is a very large factor as to why I'm not a modern music scares and threatens me composer. He encouraged me to raid his CD collection, full of recordings one couldn't find anywhere else, back in the day when this was still a thing. I will confess that at the time, I was so disinterested in hardcore contemporary classical, I dumped most of the files in a large folder marked Who Knows or Cares, and wouldn't really listen to it until several years later. At the time, however, what I took away from this whole samurai experience was the slightly cynical but I think kind of important lesson: it doesn't matter what you write, as long as you can explain it.
Burned out, alone, I lie, eat, sleep, body meets calls, all within 4 walls. Months, years pass slowly when days seem long, always the same, nothing done, nothing achieved, thoughts focused only on oneself behind the walls. Far off, carried softly on the night wind, a clock strikes the hour. In the morning, the town rumbles. There, outside the walls, people live their lives. Factories sirens call their workers. Diesel locomotives shunt and couplings clatter. Cars hoot and machines drone. Their beat, even muffled by the wall, saves me from doubt. But it isn't easy for thoughts to fly when body and mind are in a stall. But on the rising wind, my thoughts become sharp and focused. Take wing, take the right attitude, fly clear over the walls, striving, joining in the contradictions of life out there to build anew and turn my defeat into victory.
I think anybody who knows me or the persona I portray myself as on the social medias won't be surprised by the next revelation, but I really love contemporary classical music in all its shapes and forms. Over the last few years, I have spent a lot of my time and energy either consuming or sharing it with a specific focus on South African musicians. While this is not one of the embarrassing stories I intend on telling, I do cringe when I think back to an interview I did fresh off the plane from my first Samro trip, in which I declared that I wanted to be, quote, like some kind of godfather of music, to be that guy who stood on a soapbox pointing and yelling, "Listen to it!" This energy came from experiencing the scene in New York. While there was a lot that I really enjoyed and learned from the American way, something that struck me is that the musical language we have in this country, in all genres, can't be found anywhere else on earth. It is unique, it is precious, and a lot of it can easily stand side by side with what is regarded as, said in massive quotation marks, the important canon of contemporary works. Of course, a certain level of patriotism creeps in when one is not back home, but a thought I had over and over when seeing how many people would flock to see one Picasso at a gallery was, man, if only people knew what we had back home, coupled with if only we knew what we had back home. There is an energy here that one doesn't get anywhere else. For all I know, it could just be a heightened panic from not having enough rehearsals to put something together. But I remember on New Year's Eve, 2009, watching the fireworks from the top of a building in New York with jazz composer James Bassingthwaighte and thinking, people have got to hear this stuff. A philosophy I've tried to cling to since, even while rolling my eyes at the harumphing and infighting from a certain generation of composer, is firstly that there is plenty of space for everyone under the sun, and secondly, I truly believe that a rising tide affects all ships. To quote Life of Brian, solidarity, brothers. In retrospect, this thought was still had at a time when I was only skimming the surface of what was out there. Around the time of writing Moments in a Life, I started listening to a lot more international contemporary works, regularly digging through Scorefollower and the Insiptify YouTube channels. I rediscovered all the recordings I'd gotten from Samuel Friesen and went to Europe again for some really good masterclasses, with the biggest lesson standing out for me at the time being, if one intends on building the newest and most up-to-date car, and all one ever does is study blueprints of cars made in the 1950s, even with the most innovation you can muster, at best you'll design something from around the 1970s. This, with a brief crash course in spectralism, led me to writing in a slightly more electronic dance music way, but now combining it with a more contemporary art music sound world, less Shostakovich and Mahler, more John Luther Adams and Kate Soper. Also, because of all the collaborations Shant had been doing at the time, I was much more exposed to local contemporary music and the work of my peers. These projects always reminded me of the friendly competition and one-upmanship Lennon and McCartney had, and forced me having to work harder to stand out. While I had heard a little bit of the older generation of composers through my dad, as well as a lot of the newer music that the Sontonga Quartet played in the early to mid-2000s, besides for the rare novelty of a concert including a South African work, the majority of my exposure to this world before then was what we had been taught at university. During the Fees 4 movement in 2016, while having a conversation with a few students who were at UCT at the time, I asked out of curiosity who was all on the local classical syllabus these days. Please don't shoot the messenger. But as this conversation was partly about transformation at the institution, the students pointed out to me that there were only 2 women composers mentioned, 1 composer under the age of 35, and no composers of color at all. While I realize one only has so much time to teach within a semester, and I'm certain that things have greatly improved within the last 5 years, it began trains of thought along the lines of, what makes a local composer history class worthy? Feeling a little bit that unless something happened directly at a university, any university, it apparently didn't exist. With this in mind, a few years later, I asked the academic community on Facebook, so who is being taught? And it was interesting to see from the institutions that were kind enough to share their syllabi with me where names overlapped. It was probably even more interesting to see where they didn't. As I felt the few online resources available were quite out of date, in an attempt to get a more thorough idea as to what the scene is exactly all about, to borrow a popular phrase, I did my own research. I'd listen to the canon. Whenever I came across a composer I hadn't heard of, I'd write down their name and listen to whatever I could find of theirs. The most obsessive thing I did was perform a personal little audit of local ensembles with the intention of seeing which local composers and what of theirs exactly had been performed by them. For one ensemble in particular, I went as far as listing everything I could find online between 2005 and 2018, and was genuinely surprised to see that Brahms' Second Symphony had been performed less than Symphonies 3 and 4, which sure didn't feel like it at the time. After having discovered the excellent Meet the Composer podcast on NPR, I finally figured out what I could do with all this information. I began the South African Composers Archive podcast, in which I would interview anyone who would let me stick a microphone in their face, asking each composer the same 12 questions in an almost neutral way to draw as equal as possible focus on both lesser known and more prominent artists alike. Basically, present the information and let time figure it out. With an ever-growing list of over 100 composers that I wanted to interview, unfortunately after 17 episodes, the 18th one yet to be released as it will involve having to edit a 3-hour interview I did with Kevin Volans, due to a combination of burnout and the things you do for free being put aside for paid work, the show went on an extended break. Thankfully, as of a few weeks ago, it's been resurrected on the online station Ham Shack Radio, in which I play nothing but local composers in mixtape-type shows every second Monday. While this is obviously a very different feel to how it initially began, I am now able to present much more material instead of having each episode only feature the works of one composer. While, for the most part, I obviously play music that I like, I sometimes choose pieces on the merit that I truly believe there is an audience for everything and everyone, and someone out there will potentially see the beauty in it deeper than I might. I mention all of this for two reasons. Firstly, I find myself still having conversations with younger composers who resist exploring and growing their musical language in a certain direction because modern music yucky. What I always say in response is that they're clearly listening to the wrong modern music, and then try my best, like Fokkens and Friesen did for me, to show them just how varied the contemporary music world is, from extremely experimental all the way to tonal and very accessible. Secondly, with this podcast, besides for seeing this variety up close, I was basically getting free composition lessons, which greatly impacted how I write. The biggest game changer for me was the question I would ask, what is the best advice that you ever got from a mentor? Two answers stood out for me in particular. Arthur Fieder described how his teacher, Hans Rosenskön, taught him the value of constant change or development in material to keep the ear interested. Lisa Morrison, on the other hand, spoke of the Kevin Volans approach of a meter of blue is the bluest of blue. In other words, do as much as possible with as little material as possible. While this might seem like a well-no-duh statement, what I took away from all of this was that there was not one particular way of doing things, which is unfortunately something we are often taught or will latch onto without realizing it. From this point on, I approached my writing much more along the lines of something I read Caroline Shaw once say, that the content or aesthetics of what you write or how you choose to write is determined by the occasion or the setting, and as a composer, you need to be able to flip between these voices. This is especially important in film work. In other words, it doesn't matter how you write. It's all about what exactly it is you're trying to say. As a broke-ass composer in a time when the world has filled its trunks? What do you do if for decades your primary way of expression has involved working with live musicians and suddenly for 80% of the year it is no longer a viable option? What do you do if the urge to create is hanging on by a thread, but the outlet options are smaller, with collaborators having moved around the globe and organizations that should be supporting living and breathing artists, by and large, aren't? Well, apparently the answer is use what you have and play with yourself. As mentioned, I wouldn't consider myself an electronic musician at all, usually keeping most of the electronic doodles I've made to myself or only incorporating some elements of it in my soundtrack work, such as the work I did for the animated series Jungle Beat. However, during the first lockdown in 2020, like everyone, I found myself suddenly with a lot more time on my hands, and the words album crept back into the dark places of my mind. I'd been trying to make a solo album from around 2016, but struggling to crack the code as to how exactly I would do it, resources being the biggest issue. Having gone into great detail last year about my misadventures in MIDI, I'm going to skip ahead to the point where composer Kirsty Adams politely explained to me where I had been going wrong, reminding me that Sibelius files do actually work in GarageBand. Around this time, Louise Kutzer of Darkroom Contemporary asked me if, in lieu of a tour of another project that had fallen through, I wanted to write something for an online production she and Inka Kenzia were putting together for the National Arts Festival called Metamorph. As meeting up with other musicians wasn't really an option, this seemed like the perfect opportunity to experiment more with MIDI before attempting to work further on the album. Over the next few months, I would write what would become The Spaces Between Life and Living, a 60-minute concept album that deals with all the in-between moments of life, where change occurs, from simple things like going for a walk to the more complex moments of births, deaths, and rebirths. Musically, it became a blend of constant change and meters of blue, with touches of rock and tips of the hat to A Winged Victory of the Sun, Conlon Nankaro, and Daniel Rosenfeld, also known as C418, specifically the work he did for the Minecraft soundtracks, an almost 8-bit but not quite old-school video game sound world. This combined with sounds I felt had an ASMR/white noise kind of quality, reminiscent of me sitting in front of a tumble dryer for hours and hours as a child, created for me a warm blanket sound world with a lot of nostalgic comfort. Nostalgic comfort, I think, being something that many of us are using to get through this time. Embarrassing story number 3. As a child, my brother and I, 2 God-fearing children, decided the best way to celebrate Easter was to dress up as Roman soldiers, him a centurion and me one of the rabble, and fetch my taller-than-me at the time Pink Panther doll to reenact the crucifixion by tying him up to some planks in the backyard after dressing him in a pair of my white undies. I've long subscribed to a philosophy of Snoopy creator Charles M. Schulz's, which is, if you are in a position to say something, you should. 2020 was the year I wrote works that were all about processing the grief of the world shutting down, such as the aforementioned album or the trio Moment of Parting. However, being stuck in this loop of the endless today, never tomorrow, has left me in a position of feeling that everything that could be said about the current situation has by now already been said, and I would just be repeating myself or saying things very similar to other artists. As an example, when Jeffrey Armstrong asked me to write him a violin sonata, I took inspiration from a story of my childhood, avoiding the reality of the now, and tapping into nostalgia by writing the most rock and roll thing I've done in years. A step further, when I was asked to write something for Anne-Marie van der Westhuizen for the recent Vrystaat Kunstefeest, the piece became Armed Only with Nothing Left to Say. Well, there definitely is the option of just writing something for the sake of sound, which is kind of what I ended up doing. Having spent so much of my energy over the years actively trying to find my voice, from aesthetics to content, all while politely raging against the machine, not having anything to say at all was extremely disheartening. The strange thing is, though, that eventually this brought with it a weird sense of freedom. To quote Bob Dylan, "When you ain't got nothing, you got nothing to lose." While studying art in Matric, I was fascinated by the Dadaist movement and particularly the work of Marcel Duchamp. From what I recall, after challenging the art world by raising the whole question about what exactly art is with works such as Fountain, Duchamp hit a point of, if everything is art and therefore there is no such thing as art, what exactly am I doing in the art world that is not a thing, as a supposed artist, also not a thing? His response was to leave the scene and instead focus all his energy on playing chess at a professional level. I have thought a lot about that baller move in the last year. I think many of us have at some point contemplated leaving the music industry, and recently I definitely have thought about it. I'm going to try my best not to turn this into a pity party, but part of what I am struggling with at the moment, besides for stuff like projects falling through left and right, is in an environment that feels like musicians are being taken for granted and contemporary art music is way down the list of priorities, I find myself asking more and more, what's the point? An already dangerous question to ask in regards to the arts. I will concede, maybe it's just me and isolation is finally getting to me, probably evident in the piece you'll see later. While I'm not going anywhere anytime soon, this is obviously affecting the direction of my music. to be clear, I do still put a lot of stock in trying to find your own voice as a composer. I think if anyone has the option of, say, listening to either Beethoven or someone who's trying to write like Beethoven, I would assume that the majority would opt to listen to the original and not a photocopy. The weird thing is, though, in this strange kind of in-between world we're currently living in, where Spotify offers the history of everything at the click of a mouse, doubt is starting to creep in. There is a student who I've spoken with a few times who very much subscribes to new music is yucky and insists on writing in a very specific romantic style. However, as I pointed out to them, I felt that this might be contributing to their frustration of not getting performances, being reminded of a conversation I'd had with Kathy Tagg many years ago. To summarize, she revealed one of the biggest truths one needs to accept as an artist. There is no reason whatsoever for anybody to give a shit about what one is creating, something I've had to learn again and again and again. I'm sure most of you watching this know this, but in the spirit of be the teacher who you wish you had, how you write depends on what you are trying to achieve with your music. If your goal is to shake up the new music scene, you have to study what has come before, and more importantly, what is happening right now. If you're absolutely happy to just write what it is you feel like writing, then do that. Start a band and just play it yourself. Create an aura of this composer writes Beethoven better than Beethoven. As an aside, while I would probably advise against the write like Beethoven route, and believe audiences are much more clever than what some concert programmers will have you believe, let's be honest, a large portion of the audience also subscribe to the New Music is Yucky newsletter, and may very well leap at something new but extremely familiar. Again, that safe nostalgia space. Call it a reboot. This is a theory that I'm kind of putting to the test at the moment, and me, for the time being at any rate, playing chess. Besides, for the piece you'll hear tonight, something I've been working on recently is the Sibelius mock-up currently playing, a completion of the piano quartet Mahler had begun as a teenager. As there already exists a really lovely completion by Schnittke, and Uri Khan's reworkings of Mahler's work are phenomenal, when Armstrong commissioned me to do my own take on it, I opted to go the longest possible way around, and instead of using my regular voice, write a piece that is around 80% in his style, or the best impersonation of his style I, a humongous Mahler fan, can do. Or, as I described it to a friend of mine recently, a type of fan fiction, using Gustav as a puppet, almost putting my voice through a filter. While the sound world choice is obviously very specific to the project, I will confess that once the piece is out there, my biggest worry is having audiences turn around and say, "We hate everything else you do, just write like that." Which brings me to the film I made for tonight. Once Upon a Time in a Southern Suburb is a 20-minute suite of sorts, built around music I had written around the time of the first lockdown and reworked for this festival. It's an extremely tonal continuation of the C418 meets ambient sound world I've been messing around with, but this time with more of a slant towards 1980s synthpop, sort of a blend between the lesser-known song Dancer by Queen, off their famously hated album Hot Space, and the work done by local synth group May May May, who you might know from their recent hit Ek en jou dik gat. While I'm still on the fence about whether or not I'd like to expand this work into another album or just leave it as is, the fun for me began more when I opted to make a short film about the creative process and the importance of self-editing, basing it on the Stephen King quote, kill your darlings, even when it breaks your egocentric little scribbler's heart, kill your darlings." A massive shout out and thank you to my friend Max Richter, who helped with this incredibly silly project. This is not Dylan going electric, it's not meant to be groundbreaking, it's not meant to stir up debates, other than, is he getting enough sleep? All it is me having a little bit of fun during this stupid time in history, using this event as an excuse to hang out with my friend while trying to process almost 3 decades of voice searching, and that ultimately it doesn't matter how or what you write. just as long as it makes you happy.
Matthijs, fabulous, fabulous. Can you hear me? Oops, I think you muted Matthijs. There we go.
There we
Hang
go.
on.
Yes. Yeah. No, I just said you need to unmute me. Can you hear me now?
Well, I think we whoever's muted or unmuted, I think we're safe for now. Man,
Great.
this is vintage Tom Sharp.
I don't know who that is, but sure. Yeah.
So first of all, Matthijs, a very, very interesting, multifaceted presentation that had me in stitches and in tears, mostly at the same time. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I don't see any questions at this point in time in the chat. However, and I would like to add, I don't think I'm the right person to even begin to delve in what you said, but you're kind of stuck with me. So here we go. On a serious tangent here for a bit. You mentioned that as you'd finished, say, your university education, you were seriously considering stepping out of the music scene, leaving music behind completely.
Yeah. I mean, so once I finished my undergrad at UCT, there was a good, I want to say 3-4 years or something like that before, it was about 3 years before I even bothered with the Samro bursary. 2 years, sorry, 2 years. But it was just that thing of that by the time I had finished the degree, I was so done with studying. Yeah. And which I think is pretty common from what I understand. But but then when I eventually used it and started getting all these master classes, by the end of that, there was that one master class that I mentioned where I was just kind of like, I'm done. Like there's really like the whatever enjoyment was there.
Yeah. Oh,
sorry, I wasn't sure what the question was.
I was actually trying to explore it a little bit further. So you mentioned you explained that you'd become hurtful actually of all of this. And my question actually is the decisions and the influences that made you continue, that resulted in you actually continuing as a musician. Do you think there's any value in revisiting those influences, those decisions, and apply them to the current situation where I sense that you are still in two minds, or whether should I get out?
No, 100%. It is sort of while I was working on that on the video, there has been, and it's nice to see that two of the bandmates are there, Cara and Galina. I mean, we obviously with Nightlight Collective and Chart Ensemble did a lot of stuff together, and as you know, they're now all over the world. And it is something that I have been thinking about more and more, speaking with Sarah Evans as well, about the notion of just like starting a band again and just sort of doing that. And I think, I mean, as I say in the clip, I think that's something that's very important. I think it's something that as I mentioned, I am surprised that there are not more composer performers around to do that. And I mean, from first-hand experience, I know it's a bit of a pain in the butt because it's now suddenly you have to, especially like when we were doing the monthly residency at the Blah Blah Bar, it was a thing of that every month was a different setup, a different size group. So you learn very quickly to sort of like, okay, we need a 50-minute program and we need to start rehearsing on this day, and you just write. And I was very lucky then when the Goldberg piece came along.
Yes.
During that period, it's probably the most fit I have been as a writer ever. I think it's like also around that time I was doing a lot of film stuff. Yes. So it just like, you know, any muscle, the more you do it, the easier it is then to produce. But yeah, it is definitely something that I have been thinking about more and more again. The hardest part, like on the one hand, I kind of want to post something on Facebook and go, who wants to start a band? But then it's sort of like, you don't know who will sort of crawl out of the woodwork there. It's just like, I love your recorder playing, but no, but it's that sort of, so there are some people that I've been speaking with about the potential of maybe starting something new. And just sort of that idea of, you have to ultimately, you have to create your own opportunities. And I mentioned that a little bit about how it took me so long to find a quartet that would be interested in performing the piece, the personal graffiti piece. And it was just, I don't know, like, so there was a group at one point which I wanted to mention in the talk, but just for time left out, which there was a point where myself, Cara Stacey, and Petra Hofmeyer were going to do a thing called the New Sound Consort. And it was very much based on the format that I had seen in the States of, I think, of American Modern Ensemble with the composer Robert Patterson, where it would be sort of, you had these concerts and bars, but it would sort of be a mix of contemporary works.
Yes.
And when I came back from that trip, I remember having this conversation with Cara and with Petra at the time. I was pretty adamant that I was just like, I'm not going to play. Like all I want to do is like, I want to try and, I will speak to composers, I will source material, I will like do all that. But then obviously the side of just like how much time it takes then to like practice and rehearse and all that, to sort of distance myself from it. So it took me a very, very long time. And as I mentioned, with the help of Sarah and Rob Falkins, to kind of, just do it. Like, you like playing in bands, you like playing in groups. So there you go, create your own thing.
Right.
To the point where there was a message about 2-3 nights ago that I got from Sarah about a venue, and she sort of sent me a message just saying, these are the players I'd like to work with, this is the venue, are you interested? And I was just like, yes, I don't even need to think about it, like let's do it. I mean, if that happens is another story, but it is that just thing of like, that you have to kind of, what I said about like, the more you do, the more people become aware of you as an artist. You build your own audiences, especially if you are collaborating with other people. There is sort of like a crossover there that, some of your audience goes on with them and you gain some of their audience, etc.
Right.
I mean, like, the big issue, and this is something that I've been thinking about a lot at the moment, obviously, is with COVID and venues, and like, how do you do it? I mean, I'm sure one could find a lounge somewhere of someone who would be willing to do it, but then obviously, you want to be as safe as possible and everything like that. So those kind of complications come. I was recently watching that Let It Be, or the Get Back, Peter Jackson, like 8-hour Beatles documentary, and was watching it thinking like, let's go find a roof. I think that's the solution. Like, we get a string quartet and we go play on the roof. Like, it's open air or something like that. But anyway, so I definitely think that is where I am leaning towards.
Right.
I mean, there is another group that I have that I didn't mention, where we've also sort of been on hiatus, I guess, for a couple of months, which is a thing that I do called Photoplay with Louisa Tias, the flautist. And it's basically, the idea behind it is to use contemporary living existing composers to write soundtracks, and on the basis as well, that thing of like, well, if you're part of this, you're playing. If you write something, you have to play. And we do silent short films, which is also kind of, is quite a nice way just to flex the muscles a little bit. So that's also kind of on the side. But I think the more I think about it, the more I talk about it, the more it looks like there definitely will be something somewhere on the horizon.
That is very, very good news indeed. I think Cara Stacey has posted to the entire chat a point about, or she makes the point that it's incredibly hard to keep up the energy that is required to drive things, to drive projects, to drive this self-enterprise. And you end up being an little ecosystem on your own that has to cater for everything, including earning a living, and that's not
Yeah.
simple.
It's, yeah, no, it is very tiring. It is, I mean, that thing of, like, let's be absolutely honest. I mean, like, all those blah blah bar gigs and stuff, I mean, like, you'd earn nothing. Like, it would
Yeah.
really be like you take whatever you get from the door. um the problem, I mean, like, we loved it because it meant like a big audience and it was fun to play to a lot of people. But then obviously the more people you have, the smaller the cut then gets from the door, and obviously the venue takes a cut as well, which is not always great. They were sort of, I do remember kind of conversations of sort of like, this is mine and this is yours. It's just like,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but all those people, like, what do we do there? But it's it's part of the business.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, as Kara says, I mean, to keep that energy is very, very difficult. I know they definitely, I mean, there was a conversation that Kara and I had at one point where it felt for a long time that I was sort of like driving the group of kind of like,
Yeah.
or the energy at any rate.
Yeah.
And I remember her saying to me at the time, I was going through a lot of stuff at the time, but it's just like, if that energy is not there, then everything just sort of like sits. And
Yes. Yes.
finding that kind of like, okay, that impetus of like, okay, let's start again, like, let's get, rehearsals, guys, we've got to figure this out.
Right. Right.
So yeah, it is very, very difficult. And as you say, that thing of like, if you are also, you got to pay rent, got to,
Absolutely. Yeah.
eat at the end of the day, which is kind of, I mean, what happened with the podcast, where it just became that, I'm doing it out of my own time. And like, the interviews were fun, and I really enjoyed speaking to everyone that I did, and would obviously love to do more of them. But then it's that sort of thing of like, the moment once you've sat and done like a 2-hour interview and you're like, wow, that was great. And then it's just that brief moment of like, how am I going to edit this? I need to figure out like, how I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
So at least like that, the radio thing that I'm doing, new show tomorrow at 5, it's just that thing of, on Hamtech Radio, if I'm going to do this, but it's that thing of like, there it was given a lot more the option of, they offered to me that if I wanted to do an interview thing, I could do it like that. But then it was just sort of like, well, for the time being, it's a lot easier for me to go in, read out some factoids, play some music, done in an hour, go home. And it's still that, like, I mean, again, like, it's not like one's earning anything out of it or anything like that, but it is that just kind of like, cool, this just gives me something to the wheels can still keep turning, and for another 2 weeks, and then start again, and it's still in the spirit of the other thing. Still kind of trying to, as best I can, share all the various voices that we have here. Yeah.
I don't want to overstay my welcome, but there is one more thing. I'd like to step out of this, which I experience as a current like crisis management situation due to COVID, etc. I'd like to step outside of this for a moment. Then I'd like to make perfectly clear that I regard you as an established composer with your own voice, but I'm very curious to know what the early influences of your father's teaching, education, exposure, what that consisted of. What went down there?
Well, I mean, a lot of the stuff was works that I had heard him listening to. I mean, I have very fond memories of, driving home in a car in the radio days. And, like, there are a couple of pieces I remember. I remember it was the Goon Show, actually, but I do remember sort of like, you get home, it's that thing of like, you get home and you've got whatever piece is playing,
Right.
whatever piece is playing on the radio, and you just sort of sit in the driveway, and you're like, I'm not going anywhere until this is finished. And I mean, that's where there were a lot of Goon Show episodes, but they were definitely there was a lot of I mean, I remember listening to like Mahler's Second Symphony for the first time, parked in front of the driveway because we were about 15-20 minutes away from the end. There was a lovely the real bummer that I was meant to meet him, and then he said like, come on over, and then went quiet. But one of the reasons I traveled to America was to meet Goliath. And the first time I'd heard anything of his was my brother, my dad, and myself just driving around to Sea Point. It was a beautiful evening, and the Isaac the Blind happened to come on the radio. And it was just like the three of us all just kind of went like, what is this? And that became like a very extended trip through Cape Town. But I mean, other stuff like at the time growing up, I would bring him music. I would bring him stuff that I'd written. I got the "Don't Write Like Beethoven" conversation from him when I was a kid. Or there would be, or even not to write like Beethoven. There would be sort of gestures that I would do, and he would go, "Well, you could like sort of finishing the phrase dum de dum de dum,
Right.
or you could go dum de dum, new idea." And it's just like, oh, okay, this is I didn't
Right.
think of that. Like, that I need to finish the sentence before I start. I mean, I mentioned Stravinsky. He's a massive Stravinsky fan, or he's a massive Stravinsky fan, so would have heard Writer's Spring and Firebird and Petrushka and stuff like that growing up. I remember also which I think definitely also affected how I approach writing and the whole finding one's voice thing. It's through him and through the Beatles. And both cases, it's that thing of like seeing an artist change and develop and evolve their sound over sometimes big periods of years, sometimes small periods. But I mean, I remember having a conversation with him at the time when he wrote the piece about nothing, which for him was very kind of like him trying to use as little material as possible, just all kind of minor thirds. And through that, having conversations about Reich and Adams and people like that, or he would send me documentaries that he'd been watching and sort of like, you may enjoy this.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, everything from orchestration techniques to just stylistic stuff. The one, like, so composition lessons were great. The one thing that I learned is maybe not a good idea is to have piano lessons, because then you'd start having sort of conversations which would start like, well, I have noticed that you haven't really been practicing much this week. And so it like that becomes a little bit more complicated.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, that stuff and rating his LP collection and things like that, and just sort of seeing what he had. Yeah.
Wow. I don't see any fresh questions in the chat. If anybody would like to chip in, please bump me off the airwaves. Perhaps we need a quick breather before the concert tonight. Matthijs, how can I thank you? I do hope we keep in touch, and I do hope there's
Thank you.
opportunity in future to explore, please.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a lot of fun doing this.
Cool. Keep well. Take care. Ciao.
Thank you, you too. Cheers,
Bye.
everyone.